Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good night. Welcome to this month's RELO Andes webinar. I am your host, Dr. Amy Simpson-Burden. I am an English language specialist working at the U.S. Embassy in Lima, Peru, and I am joined by our guest speaker today, Dr. David Chiesa. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. David Chiesa. I'm a clinical assistant professor of language and literacy education at the University of Georgia. When Dr. Amy asked me to come talk to you, I had to stop what I was doing and, of course, support her as much as I can. Amy is just an amazing person who has such a knowledge of experience all around the world supporting English language learners. And of course, I had to be here. So welcome, everybody, and I hope you enjoy.
Thank you so much for agreeing to be here. I'm really looking forward to our conversation this afternoon.
Awesome.
So we're going to be talking about materials that matter, choosing the right materials for your English language classroom so that you can really unlock student engagement using texts that promote engagement, promote involvement with your students, and promote learning.
Yeah. Engagement is such a interesting word, Amy. Like, how would you define engagement for you?
In practical terms, when I see my students' eyes, they're lighting up, they are communicating with me, communicating with one another, they are on topic. That's what engagement looks like in my classroom. What about you?
You know, Amy, have you ever listened to a song that you love or read a book that you love and you just got so immersed in the time?
Yeah, I have a few songs that are my go-to when I need that kind of pick-me-up.
It's just when that time doesn't exist because you're just always in that flow state, right? That's what I mean by engagement. Like when we give our students tasks and activities in which time just flies by, they're engaged. It's when their skills and their challenges are met. It's not too hard. It's not too easy. Mm-hmm. It's just right. So they could be more engaged in the learning process.
Right. I love that, the idea that time flies by, and that's a marker for an engaged class.
Yeah.
So where in the world are you joining us from today? Will you let us know in the chat where you are joining us from? I see we already have some people who have greeted us. Hi, Cindy from Bolivia, and Halim from Chicalao. And let's see, we have Juan Carlos from Peru as well. Wanda from Bolivia. We have a lot of people joining us and already responding to our questions. That's awesome.
Nice.
Daniel, good to see you. Glad you're here. Gabby, Jose, great to see you. Mariella, thanks for joining us.
Wow.
Buenas tardes.
Alfredo, nice to meet you. Erica, welcome.
Let's see. We've got a lot of people joining us from Bolivia and Peru. I think our RELO Andes team was in Bolivia earlier this month. So I think perhaps some of our viewers participated in some activities that our RELO Andes team did.
Amy, you have somebody from Morocco.
Morocco, that's awesome. Thanks so much for joining us.
So cool.
Very cool. Well, please keep letting us know where you're joining from, and we'll keep an eye on the chat. So here's kind of an overview of what we're going to be talking about during this 30 minutes or so. So first, we'll answer the question, or attempt to answer the question, should you use a textbook in your classroom? And whatever materials you do choose, how can you choose materials that promote engagement? And finally, how can you choose materials that positively represent all your students?
I love these questions. I think they're really helpful for both teachers who are new to the teaching field and also those that have been doing this for years.
Yeah, I know. I had been teaching for a long time before I really considered who or what was in the materials. If the language was appropriate, let's go for it. I didn't really consider who was represented and who wasn't until I was quite a bit into my teaching career.
Wait, doctor, how many years have you been teaching?
Let's see. I want to say this is 17.
Whoa. Whoa. That's wonderful.
I began as a child. That's
That's great.
yeah. What about you? How many years have you been in the classroom?
Since 2001. It's about 22 years.
2 years.
That's 23. Yeah, that's a long time.
That's a
I've,
long
I mean,
time.
I've taught all ages from pre-K to 12th grade to adults to 99-year-olds, the whole spectrum.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's awesome. Most of my students have been adults or college students.
Yeah.
Although I have taught children on occasion, but I definitely enjoy the adult language classroom.
Children, I love children. They're special.
They're special. If you are interested in learning more about choosing the right materials for your classroom, I have got several resources that I'll share with you in the chat. There's an article in the English Language Teaching Forum called Adapting Textbook Activities for Communicative Teaching and Cooperative Learning. There's also a really interesting article on getting your students to write the materials for the classroom. And then I wanted to provide you guys with a pretty extensive list of open source materials that you can use in your classroom. Open source means that they're free for you to use. Some of them are free for you to use as they are. Others, you can adapt them to fit your needs. So we'll share those resources in the chat, and you can take a look at them after the webinar.
Doctor, have you ever had your students write materials for your classes?
Yes, I have really enjoyed that in my writing classes, having students take a first draft of an essay. And they typically, if I don't tell them who to write for, they write for me. And then I ask them to change the audience. They can choose anyone, hopefully someone who'd be interested in what they're writing, and completely rewrite the essay to that other audience. Add in lots of pictures, maybe some movement. I had students do YouTube videos. One person even did an interpretive dance to go with her essay. And so I've had students teach their own writing. I've had students teach teach other students how to use different online sources. And so what about yourself?
I'm in the same boat as you.
Yeah.
I love having my students or the students who learn language create their own materials from scratch, because it's about their main interests and main desires of how or what kind of content they find most engaging, right? I keep wanting to go back to that word engagement, right?
Yeah.
And so I've done it with middle school, elementary school, high school adults. Everybody likes to just dive in and make their own materials.
I've also had students choose their own materials. Maybe they didn't make them, but they did go find an article that they wanted to discuss in class. They brought it in, prepared the discussion, and led it. And that was a lot of fun, getting students to bring in what interested them and allow everyone to be a part of that.
That's awesome.
So what about you? What English teaching materials do you use? Do you use textbooks? I know some schools require teachers to adopt a textbook, or maybe the state or province adopts a textbook for you. Other schools are given a lot of flexibility in what kinds of materials you use. So let us know in the chat, what kinds of English teaching materials do you use? Hi, Maria. Thanks for joining us. And Alex, great to see you. Marlon says that they use textbooks in their classrooms.
Awesome. Marlon, did you choose the textbooks? Or were they given to you?
Gina also says textbook. And I wonder, did you get to choose the textbook, or did an administrator give you the textbook? Daniel shares that he uses textbooks, personal experience, videos, and social media.
Cool.
I'm very curious about how you use social media in your classroom.
I like the personal experience too.
Yeah.
Sweet.
Yolanda uses textbooks with supplementing and changing some things. What kinds of things do you typically change?
Great.
Javier, you have an English platform. Is that like an online book or an online site that your class uses?
Sweet. We have a wide variety.
Yeah. Karen says that they get to choose their textbooks and they're also free to add supplementing material.
Nice.
Yeah. That's how most of my classrooms have been. I've been asked to choose a textbook, but I've also had the freedom to use my own materials. There were a couple of courses that I had to create from scratch, and what the students needed just didn't exist in a book. And so I ended up creating the materials for both the classes along with a cohort of teachers at the university. And that was a lot of fun.
I got to ask you, Doctor, what class did you make from scratch in which the need was not in the book?
Okay. So my students were in a bridge program, meaning they had graduated from either an undergraduate or graduate school in their home country, and they had not met all of the requirements for entry into the university in the states where I was teaching. So I was giving them, they were taking 2 classes from me, and they were taking 2 classes in the university. My 2 classes were supposed to kind of fill in some of those gaps, be a bridge. And because we were a small liberal arts college, the bridge needed to be kind of specific. It needed to be, how do I go from this class to Dr. Wynn's Comp 101? Yeah. How do I go from this class to Dr. Shu's communication course? And so I got to work with those undergraduate professors who are going to see the students next semester and design a curriculum that met their needs that year.
Awesome.
It was a lot of fun.
A lot of work, but rewarding, huh?
Yes. Yeah. And especially because every year that needed to be revisited as students' needs changed, as new majors were added to the curriculum, that kind of thing.
Cool.
Nelson gets to use flashcards besides textbooks and apps and links. I really enjoy using apps with my students too. All right, so let's take a look at our first question. Dr. Chiesa.
Yeah,
should you really use a textbook?
And you know what Dr. Amy just said, right? Like, she's like, I want to use a textbook, but you know what? It doesn't fit the needs of my learners. I want to first problematize whether or not you should use textbooks, because I want to come at this from an SLA or second language acquisition perspective, right? So we know in the literature and the research, right, that children and adults learn a little bit differently and on the context that they're in. So imagine if you're in an ESL context, but a lot of our colleagues here are from an EFL context, right?
Right.
So do children learn better, or I don't want to use the word better, I need to problematize that. Do children learn differently or faster when they're in an EFL context with textbooks, or do adults learn better with textbooks?
It's an interesting comparison to see if there is a group that learns better with textbooks than without. Exactly. In my experience and in reading the research, adults tend to like explanations.
Yes, exactly.
So
adults tend to learn faster with more explanations, or we kind of call explicit learning, where children tend to learn more with implicit learning. But if you're in Bolivia or if you're in Peru, right, is there enough input or language in the country, in the classroom, that is allowed for children to learn implicitly, or should we supply them with a textbook? So there are a lot of questions that come up. For adults, we might want to focus more on textbooks because they are a little bit more explicit. For children, you want to focus less, maybe. Again, context specific, right?
Yeah.
So that's just something I want to problematize with you. Think about your situation and who is learning in your context, right? That's the first thing I would say.
Yeah, and Yolanda's already weighed in on that. She
Oh,
said she thinks it's we should use it to the point it's useful, but we should have room to use other resources to complement with authentic language and topics that are relevant for our students.
yes.
I really like your use of the word complement. You're thinking through what your learners need and how the text and other materials can complement one another to fit those needs.
And it's all about the needs, isn't it?
Absolutely. Santi says that we can use textbook as a guide and include other sources. I think that's how I've tended to use textbooks before, is maybe it keeps me on pace. I have an idea of what my students need to be exposed to by the end of a selected course. But how we do that might not be from the book.
Yeah, a lot of teachers like to use the textbook to keep you on pace because in some countries around the world, right, they need to take a test at the end of their studies.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes teachers need that to make sure that they're hitting the needs of the learners so they can pass the exam.
So that's another thing to consider, the age of your learner, but also the purpose for taking the English class.
That's right.
Are you taking an English class because you have a test that you must pass in order to move forward?
Yes,
Or
right.
are you taking an English class because you'd like to travel or because you are attending college and it's a requirement? Yeah.
There's so many different needs that need to be addressed.
Yeah.
I like that. So when we think about what textbooks can do and how they can support engagement, do you remember what I said about engagement, right? It's about being in that flow and that time doesn't really exist. We kind of need to think more about how does learning happen in the language classroom? What kind of different contexts allow for it? So if we look at these pictures here, right? I like to think what is similar and different about each of these pictures. Amy, what do you see? If you the top left is number 1, top right's number 2, bottom left 3, bottom right 4. What is similar about these pictures?
So the top right is the one that looks the most different. The others, have students who appear to be, well, I guess all of them have students who are engaged, just in different ways.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. So the top left, right? The teachers kind of supporting the learners to have the conversation with each other, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe the textbook was used, it has an activity about conversation starters or debates maybe, or something in there that the teacher guides everybody to work together to talk to each other. Yeah. The top right tends to be our typical view of what we mean by individual engagement with the material, because we can learn individually as well. So we're at home and we connect with the materials, resources on our own because we don't have other outside resources. Mm-hmm. Bottom left, where's the teacher at in the bottom left?
Yeah, she is happily watching the conversation happen. She's there if she's needed, but she's happy that they're working together without her.
Exactly, and they all have a textbook in front of them or materials, mm-hmm. but the teacher's taking a step back, so learners can learn from each other in that picture. In the bottom right, the teacher is doing our typical, lecture style, mm-hmm. probably from content from the textbook. So again, the textbook can offer different kinds of engagement with yourself in the top right, with each other top left, with your peers in the bottom left, or even the teacher directed to students. So textbooks provide wonderful ways for engagement. We just got to be clever about how we do it.
Right. Santi has been commenting on these pictures as well. Say students work in groups, helping one another, listening to the teacher, and participating in class. Sweet. So that's a good way to consider what does engagement look like in these pictures. They're helping one another, listening to the teacher, and participating.
And again, Santi, where's a textbook in this process? It could be a complement, right, mm-hmm. to the actual teaching.
Yeah, and Jose says that engagement is going to be triggered as long as books come up with student-centered activities, such as collaborative ones. And I think books can be really useful for that. I have having worked with RELO Andes for the last 6 or 7 months, I think you as teachers are also really good at that.
Yeah.
I'm always learning from these webinars, new ideas for engaging my students.
Can I challenge you, Jose? I want to challenge you. So sometimes, because I think what you said was books come up with student-centered? Is that what he said?
Books come up with student-centered activities, such as collaborative ones.
So I challenge you.
Yeah.
I challenge you, Jose, to find activity in a textbook that is not student-centered and make it student-centered.
Ooh.
Just a challenge. Dun, dun, dun.
Dun, dun, dun.
And so just what Dr. Amy said, right? And we talked about engagement. We talked about different contexts, different needs. I seriously believe that if you do want to use a published textbook, the best approach is first finding the needs of your learners, right? Just what Dr. Amy said. I mean, I can't say it any better. Think about her situation with the bridge, right? You got to find out your students' needs. What are things that they need to learn from the class, learn from each other, learn from you, both in content-wise? What kind of structure do they need to learn of the language? What kind of function do they need to learn for the language, and for what purposes, right?
Who do you ask to learn those needs? Because I know for my students, I could ask them, but I also needed to ask their other professors, hey, what do they seem to be struggling with? Or what projects do you expect them to know how to do when they come to your class? How can I help prepare them for you? So what do you think? Who do you talk to?
Yeah.
To answer these questions?
Doctor, that's such a great question. I try to include all stakeholders. Stakeholders is a key word. It means anyone that's really involved, both directly and indirectly, in the student's learning. So for example, right now I work with children in an elementary school in Georgia. I talk to the students directly. I talk to the teachers, just like Amy just said, but then I also talk to families.
Yeah.
I then talk to administrators. I talk to government officials. I try to find the whole context and talk to as many people as possible to find out what is really needed. So not just students and teachers, but parents, administrators.
And if you're conducting a class, like I know that Peru has an ESL class for tourist police. So yeah, isn't that neat? So classes that are for specific work purposes, talking to people in the field to find out what language needs, what situations, what contexts they're going to need to use English, and using those as well.
That's right.
I used to work with a group that created materials for nurses who wanted to come to the US and work, and they needed to pass an English test before they came. And so talking to people in the medical field helped us design materials that would meet the needs of nurses who wanted to come work in the US.
Love it. Absolutely love it. Hey, doctor, Jose responded to my challenge.
Oh, you came up with an activity, Jose. That's awesome. Talk about yourself, like introduce yourself to the class. It might be more fruitful that students work in pairs and introduce their partners to the rest of the class. That would build up rapport. That's a really good idea.
Huzzah.
I really like that.
Huzzah.
That's a nice technique.
Good job, Jose. Now he's like, ha.
Yes, I particularly like the idea of getting a classmate to introduce someone else. You really have to pay attention then and get all those details in line.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's take a poll. Y'all have been really engaging with us already, but have you ever developed your own needs assessment? Have you ever conducted a needs assessment for your language classes? Would you be interested in learning more about how to do it? If not, or if you have, let us know in the chat.
Because we got lots of techniques you can do besides asking questions, just FYI.
I gave a workshop at Michigan TESOL on conducting needs analysis and needs assessment with language teachers. Have
Mm.
you ever done any teaching with needs assessments? What was that process like for you?
It's it can be anywhere between a day-long needs assessment to 3 years long. It depends on the goals, right? Like, so when I like to work with like organizations or corporations that are thinking about using certain textbooks,
Mm-hmm.
right? We go through much longer needs assessment and analysis, where we
Mm-hmm.
not only have conversations with people, we also give out surveys, questionnaires. We try to collect as much information as possible to then find the right textbooks that best meet the needs of the learners that program is trying to support.
Yeah. I know in the spring of this year, I conducted some focus groups with multilingual learners and their families as a needs assessment. We are creating some materials to help their children in public schools, and we're creating materials to help families be more engaged in the public school environment. So we did a focus group as our needs assessment.
I love focus groups.
Daniel says that he's developed some cultural identity programs. I'm not familiar with that term. I would love to know more about it. And Alfredo says that he's not developed a needs assessment, but would be interested in learning more. Santi would like to learn more as well.
Reach out to us after. We got lots of stuff for you.
Yes, there's some great resources. I've got an idea for another webinar now.
Huzzah!
All right.
Yeah, I want to know more about, did you say like cultural identity group?
Yes, Daniel says I've developed cultural identity programs.
That sounds really cool.
That does sound really cool.
Daniel, tell us a little bit more. I got to know a little bit more. in due time. Take your time, but I'm really interested.
Yeah. So I know that for our teachers in Peru, you're on a break right now. You're in between school years. And so this is the time when you are beginning to think through what materials you want to either adopt or how you want to begin that first month or so of classes. So how do you begin with choosing materials? Some of our ideas were to conduct that needs assessment. I also like to visit publishers' websites. A lot of times publishers will put a chapter or two online, and I can flip through it and see if I think this would be a good supplement to the curriculum, or if this would be a good standalone, if it would meet the needs of my learners. I also love using open educational resources. I think I've got another link that I'll put into the chat with a list of OER, or open educational resources. These include more than textbooks. The Smithsonian, for example, has a lot of their art freely available for you to view. And that's a great resource for spurring conversation and engagement in the language classroom.
Yeah.
I also like to borrow books from other friends in the teaching field, from libraries, things like that, to try things out. I would suggest, again, this depends on your context, but looking at books that teach 4 modes of communication versus books that teach only listening or only reading, and see which of those kinds of books would best meet the needs of your learners. There were a couple of years that I taught a reading and writing course, and so that a book that focused on those skills was perfect for what I was working with.
Cool.
I also think, looking at books that are written slightly above where the goals of your students are. So, for example, if your students are going to take an exam and they have to demonstrate a B2 mastery on the SEFR, having a book that exposes them to language that's B2, C1 is going to help them recognize more of that language when they take an exam. And I always love flipping through books when I go to the bookstore, when I borrow them, and just kind of see how the chapters are set up. What about you? When you begin considering next semester's materials, what do you do?
Next semester? Oh, no, I'm a year ahead.
Next year's materials.
So it depends on the
You get your class assignments that far ahead.
I know.
I get them in December for January.
It's just, it depends on the context I'm in. So when I was living in Uzbekistan, I would find out the class I'm teaching a week late. If I was but in the US, we have to do things a year in advance. So it's hard, Actually, I find it more challenging when you're so far out to choose what kind of textbooks I want to use as a guiding framework. My number one thing is to talk about, just ask questions to people in the field. What's going on? Sometimes for me, I like to bring in a whole bunch of people in the community that I'm in and ask them about the real world, what's happening in their context, so that I can better hear what the people on the ground to make me make better decisions in which books to choose or materials to choose. So that's what I like to do. I like to bring in other people.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I love that. What is that called? There's a word for that. Funds of knowledge, community funds of knowledge.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
So Daniel's responded to.
Oh, he did. Daniel, you responded?
Yes. Helping students become familiar or more with their culture, traditions, and history. This may include myths, legends, dance, songs, poetry, things like that. I want to take your class. That sounds like a lot of fun.
There's a professor at Texas named Schottky that I think you would learn more about, Daniel. That's all his work is about what you're doing. And right now he's doing stuff in Colombia. Yeah. Check it out.
Efrain says that they research resources from the library. I think that's great. If you've got a library that's really rich, resource rich, definitely use that. Find out books from the library for reading aloud. Yep. Very cool. So these are some of the questions that I ask myself when I'm considering whether or not a textbook is really going to meet the needs of my students. I like to see how the textbook positions my role. I think going back to the pictures that you showed earlier, depending on what the text, how dependent the textbook is on a teacher holding it and holding students' hands piece by piece through the lesson. The teacher's going to be in different places. So, and depending on the age of my learners and their purpose for taking an English class, my role might need to change. So just really understanding how the textbook expects the teacher to treat it. And then how the textbook expects students to treat it. Is it a guide, as some of y'all have said in the chat? Is it a supplement or a complement? Or is the entire curriculum wrapped up in it? When I worked in the Philippines, there was a curriculum that was pretty set that teachers needed to use in the lower grades.
Interesting.
The next question I look at is the language authentic. And that's really different depending on the context too. But in general, I like to see if the conversations in the book or the activities that they ask students to do actually get students to read or listen to language that has been spoken in the real world, or language that they are likely to need to use in the real world in a way it's actually used or spoken, and presented within a natural context, such as a newspaper or I used to use Facebook messages that I sent to my friends. I would bring them into class and we would analyze them together. Things like that's in a context that students would want and need to use language outside of my classroom.
I think that's a really good point. Something that I think all teachers, we need to think more about is whether or not authentic materials are actually helpful for our learners, right? So authentic materials, if we had to define it, right? In the context of the language classroom, include oral and written texts that occur naturally in the language environment, but have not been created or edited for language learners. So do you feel, I mean, every situation is different, right? I was working with translators and interpreters in mainland China. they needed to work with authentic materials a lot more than my learners in Japan who were in 6th grade trying to learn basic syntax.
True.
It
Yeah.
depends on your situation and your context.
Yeah, that's a good point. I know when I worked with adults, they tend to like a context where I can take this bit of language outside of the classroom and immediately use it the way I want.
That's
But
right.
that is really different
Yep.
if you're working with young learners or different. When I taught reading and writing classes, I found that having activities, if my students were going to read something, we needed to do something to get ready to help students prepare to read something brand new. And it was oftentimes a letdown if there was no discussion, there was nothing after the reading. So especially early in my career, I enjoyed ideas for getting students ready to read or getting students ready to write. And then ideas for prompting discussion after they finish the reading or writing. They go beyond just, did you understand what you read? And really get into, can we critique it? Can we learn from it? Can we, do more than just understand it? But let's have a conversation about it. So I like books that have pre and post ideas or activities included.
I agree.
Rosanna says updated books. That's a good thing to think. Go to the front page and see when that thing was published.
One of my advice, the one thing I want you to take away, is it relevant?
Yeah.
Right? Updated. Very important.
Absolutely. And then Santi says that the textbook should mention websites that we can include in our lessons too. I think that's another sign that it's an updated book, that if it's including those kinds of websites to supplement and bring in more language into the classroom. Oh, nice, Daniel. Authentic language. I totally agree. No point asking a person from the Andes to talk about a day at the beach. It has to be relevant to its life or environment.
Yep.
Yes, that's a really good point. Finally, I like to consider how the text treats grammar and vocabulary. Some older books, outdated books, kind of have a grammar section, a vocabulary section. They may not be connected to one another. They may not be connected to anything else. If I'm going to work with my students on building their skills, I'd like for things to be very connected and interdependent, so that students are getting the form, meaning, and the use of the language, as opposed to separate ends of the chapter with different focus.
Yeah. I'm not here to promote anything, but Grammar Dimensions, Form, Meaning, and Use is a great book. Just saying, if you're working with adults who want more explicit instruction.
I'm going to have to look that one up. I don't have that one. I love collecting books. So what questions do you ask when you're choosing teaching materials? I think we might actually, I'm going to watch the chat, but I also want to be mindful of your time. We're towards the end of our time together. So I'll watch the chat, but if you would share your tips for finding the right materials and asking the right questions, I'll call out some of your responses.
And so a lot of us are asking or talking about textbooks, but also just materials in general. And so really briefly, like I said before, making sure the materials are relevant and up to date, right? That's super important. There's been so many times when I've gone into a classroom when the book was actually from 1969 or 1970, right? 2, can it be used in its original form? I'm always someone who likes to adapt. Everything that's in a textbook, I adapt it for the needs of the learners. Again, for me, goes back to the needs. 2, has the source been identified in the needs assessment as of interest and value to your students, right?
Yeah, Joe says, does it give students freedom to apply what they've learned towards the end of it with room for guidance too?
I love that. I love that.
Yes, it definitely needs to provide both students and teachers freedom and flexibility, I think.
I agree.
So the final section that I think we're going to be able to hit on is considering whether or not the materials you're looking at are going to positively represent all of your learners. And I'll give you some quick tips. And then there's also a link that I'm going to put into the chat if you want some more information on reviewing materials before you present them to your class, or doing these kinds of activities with your students to get them thinking about representation. So the first thing you can do is look at the pictures and the materials that you're planning to use, whether that's a video, whether that is a comic like I've got put here. This is from a 5th grade English language development textbook that was adopted in the state of Texas. So there's a lot of English language learners in that state. So a lot of 5th graders are reading this comic strip. So looking at the pictures and considering what people are wearing, whether or not who has their head down, who has their head up, who is talking, who's listening when you talk, who gets to speak, whose ideas are shown as true or right, whose ideas aren't shown at all. And when I say count, I do mean you can count the people in the pictures to see who is represented. There was one book that I looked at there's an entire chapter in the book with no female characters, period. Like 30 or 40 pages, a couple of weeks in which a classroom only learned language from male characters. So looking at pictures, counting, you can even count words to see how many he's and she's there are, how many, and then what kinds of verbs there are. Do all language users get to go out and have adventures or go to work or do exciting things, or do only some people or characters in a book get to have adventures or go to work or do exciting things? So those are just a few of the things that I look at.
So Dr. Amy, when you saw that only males spoke, what advice would you give the teacher to do?
So one activity I've done with my students that was a lot of fun was I had them go through a reading and change all the pronouns. And then I asked them to recreate the pictures. So if we changed all these pronouns, what about the pictures would look different? So it really got students to redesign the material. I've also gotten kind of counter narratives. So let's say my students are reading a fairy tale. Yeah. And so something like Cinderella. There's Cinderella stories from all over the world. So maybe I bring in some other Cinderella stories and ask them to compare the different characters so that they can, and then choose which fairy tale they like the best and why.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. So you adapted the book accordingly to the needs of the learners.
Because you don't always get the opportunity to choose the perfect book that may not exist. So,
so the teacher has to be flexible.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we're gonna have to wrap up soon. I hate this because this is fun. So kind of a last thing for you to think through is when you're choosing materials, it's important to remember that diversity is important. Showing your learners that there are lots of different kinds of people who use English on a daily basis. They don't all look like me. They look like every color of the rainbow. And so showing that consistently to your learners, that all cultures, races, religions, and language groups can be fluent speakers of English. We also want to be sure that all characters are represented positively and fairly. We want to make certain that if we are talking about diversity, that it's natural, that it's accurate, that everyone gets a voice in the story, and that we are giving all of our students access to language that helps them use it in ways that are important to them.
Love it.
You don't always get to be the deciding factor in what language gets taught if you're doing a needs analysis, if you're trying to support your learners in their goals. It's giving them access to language that helps them use it in ways that are important to them.
Love it.
Okay, we have gone far above our time. So I think
Join us next.
Yes. Let me flip to that. Let's see if we can flip to that. Here we are. Okay. At 3:00, which is only in 15 minutes, we're going to go live on Zoom, and you can join us in a Zoom room so we can talk more about finding useful resources for your English language classroom. That Zoom link will be posted on the RELO Andes Facebook page. And I hope that you will join us in 15 minutes on Zoom so we can talk live.
It was so nice to meet you all.
Yes. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining us in today's RELO Andes webinar. As always, if you want more information, you can go to americanenglish.state.gov. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, I believe on X as well, at the Regional English Language Office, U.S. Embassy, Lima. Thanks, everyone. Bye.